Class Warfare is a new book from J. Martin Rochester decrying the state of public education in the United States. He spoke about it recently at Left Bank Books in St. Louis, Missouri, for about an hour.
I've got to take you back to the 1980s when our two sons, Stephen and Sean, were in University City, Missouri, in the suburbs of St. Louis, and a progressive-minded principal had just come to Delmar Harvard Elementary School. And I started noticing that the newsletters sent home had fewer and fewer references to words like rigor and merit and discipline, and more references to self-esteem and inclusion and equity and diversity and all the buzzwords we hear these days. And of course, my first reaction was, well, these are innocent enough. Who can be against equity and diversity? But I began to realize that what I was witnessing was a paradigm shift. That is a complete, total, utter relaxation and indeed collapse of standards. I first saw this when the principal announced there would no longer be any ability groups in reading. We'd have no more red birds or blue birds. All birds were to be the same feather so that we didn't damage anybody's self-esteem. We were told, quote, this is almost a direct quote as I recall it, all the research shows that heterogeneous grouping, mixed ability grouping, does not hurt high-achieving students. End of quote. And in other words, we were told that the mission of the public schools apparently was no longer about stretching kids' minds, but rather damage control. As long as your kid was not hurt by what was happening due to some new pedagogical theory, you should be happy. This, for me, was a real epiphany. The next epiphany, though, came in middle school. My older son, Stephen, was an all-county saxophone player. And in the middle school at University City, he was looking forward to playing in the renowned University City High School jazz band that you had to audition for, and that had produced remarkable musicians, including the chief accompanist of Wynton Marsalis and Harry Connick. But we were told that the jazz band was being phased out and folded into the marching band because, quote, it was too elitist. John Brophy, the band director, a wonderful band director, left. He quit, resigned, went to John Burroughs, an elite private school in St. Louis, as many of you know. And so the public schools' loss was the private schools' gain. This is a classic case of the public schools shooting themselves in the feet. We moved across the border into Clayton, a neighboring district, and we became house poor in order to send our kids to a school district that at least one national publication had rated the third best school district in America. But much to our chagrin, we began to see similar buzzwords uttered in Clayton, and a similar philosophy to some extent, beginning to seep even into Clayton. And it became clear to me that this was not a U-City problem or a Clayton problem or a Missouri problem. It was a national problem. That is, what I call in the book pack pedagogy was everywhere. Not only in Clayton and Parkway and Wellston and virtually every school district in the heartland of the U.S. here in St. Louis, but also in my brother's school district in Montgomery County, Maryland. In California, where like the storm systems, most of the trends start. And it was everywhere, coast to coast. I'm talking here about inventive spelling, whole language, fuzzy math, cooperative learning, heterogeneous, multiple intelligences theory, and full inclusion. And what basically, in my judgment, has been an attack on gifted education, on honors courses, on merit-based grouping, based on a very well-intentioned, but nonetheless misplaced obsession with the bottom. With lowest common denominator education, kind of late woebegone culture, what E.D. Hirsch has called educational populism, and what the former assistant superintendent for curriculum in my own school district in Clayton actually called her commitment to mass excellence. And I tried to explain to her mass excellence is an oxymoron. And this is a brilliant individual, by the way, but it shows you the kinds of even brilliant minds in K-12 education that don't always get it. Now, I'm going to say a lot of politically incorrect things, and I say a lot of politically incorrect things in the book. In fact, some people have tried to label me a social Darwinist. There's a slight problem with that. In 1995, on the 50th anniversary of the United Nations, the local chapter of the United Nations Association named me one of 50 St. Louisans who had dedicated their lives to peace and justice. So I'm not exactly a poster boy for social Darwinism. I believe very strongly that all kids can learn, they should learn, they must learn. As a taxpayer, I am committed to certainly paying tons of resources to slow learners, to kids with disabilities. That's not at issue. At issue is whether the new progressive paradigm works for any kids, the bottom, the middle, or the top. Also at issue is whether schools that attempt to provide special opportunities for academic excellence with a capital E should be vilified or should be celebrated. I think they should be celebrated. The question I have, and that I raise in the book, is who's the elitist? Is it someone who thinks such opportunities for academic excellence should be available only in private schools? Or someone like myself who argues that public schools should stand for academic excellence no less than private schools? I want to say up front, by the way, and there may even be some faculty here from Clayton, my home district. I say in the book, and I'll say it here, Clayton is a world-class school district, and I genuinely mean that. They do wonderful things. Last year, I think 10% of the senior class were National Merit Scholars, which is absolutely remarkable. So in many ways, this is a wonderful school district, and I don't mean to insult anybody, but one of the punchlines of the book, in fact, maybe the main punchline of the book, is that even that questionable things are going on, not just in the usual suspects we all criticize, the inner city schools, but even in the very finest, best, most upscale suburban schools in America, and certainly Clayton is one of those. Let me elaborate. Let me try to run through a few things fairly quickly. I will probably not get through all this. That's fine. We'll leave time for Q&A. I'm going to talk about 5 fads in particular that I've only hinted at. Fad number 1 is teacher as coach. The emphasis increasingly is on teacher as coach, the guide on the side, facilitating independent and cooperative learning, having children take increasing responsibility for their own learning. And this is in contrast to the traditional direct instruction lecturing, which progressives love to caricature as sage on the stage, yell and tell, chalk and talk. The problem, it makes for a great soundbite. The problem is what we're often left with the progressive paradigm is what I call the Socratic method minus Socrates. Teacher as cheerleader, peer editing, which is usually the blind leading the blind, I think. And this is all captured, by the way, in a cartoon that I tried to get into the book, and I wasn't able to, but some of you I distributed to beforehand. And the cartoon depicts a child in the ocean flailing his arms wildly as he's drowning, and there are 2 lifeguards on shore that are watching all this very calmly, and one matter-of-factly says to the other, "We're trying to get him involved in his own rescue." Well, if I had a dime for every time I heard the phrase teacher as coach in Clayton or elsewhere and in the scholarly literature, I'd be very rich. I wouldn't have to be doing these kinds of gigs, actually. Bill Mendelson, the social studies coordinator in Clayton, who I have enormous respect for, wrote an article in the Clayton Curriculum Quarterly a couple years ago in which he confessed that his own colleagues tended to be somewhat defensive and apologetic when they admitted that they lectured, that is, taught. I have nothing against active learning. In the 1970s, I directed a National Science Foundation project on undergraduate international studies that pioneered learning by doing. I use simulations, I use role-playing exercises, et cetera, but I use them as supplements to teaching, not substitutes. I don't know about you, but I'm not paying $50,000 a year for average teacher salaries for teachers to be facilitators and to get out of the way. Now, in my judgment, what's driving this teacher as coach thing is an obsession with the bottom. There's an assumption that the entire student body now suffers from attention deficit disorder. It gets bored easily, needs to be provided fun and games constantly. These days, often by a computer that is becoming a high-tech, glorified babysitter. As one observer said, we've had a generation of absentee parents. Now, apparently, we want a generation of absentee teachers. All right, fad number 2 is the heterogeneous mixed ability group classroom. And I referred briefly to this in the jazz band episode. I think as the jazz band episode shows pretty clearly, merit and competition are now 4-letter words in many American schools. Performance-based ability grouping is considered elitist. An exemplar of this is a fellow named Alfie Kohn. Some of you may be familiar with him, a leading progressive, who, if you read Alfie Kohn's work, you would think he was some sort of radical Marxist on the far extreme fringe of K-12 education, but in fact, Kohn is a mainstream thinker, reflected in the fact he was recently a keynote speaker at the National Council of Teachers of English Convention and National School Superintendents Convention. Kohn wrote an article, and I cite him simply as an exemplar of this problem. He wrote an article in Phi Delta Kappan, which is a very prominent education journal, in March of 1988, entitled "Only My Kid: How Privileged Parents Undermine School Reform," in which he attacked honors courses, grades, testing, and virtually everything else associated with standards, and called any parents who supported such things, quote, "Volvo vigilantes." Now, in response, I wrote a piece called "What's It All About, Alfie?" A parent educator's response to Alfie Kohn. To my delight, Kappan published it. You can read it in October 1998, Kappan. I was going to quote briefly from the article, but in the interest of time, I'm not going to do it. The article, some of the passages appear in the book. I guess I'll quote just one quick passage. It makes about as much sense to put an intellectually gifted child into the same math or English or science class with a low to average student as it would be to put Kohn or most human beings on the same basketball court with Michael Jordan. Would we expect Michael's game to improve as a result of playing against Alfie? Would we expect Alfie's game to improve? There's a lot more, but in the interest of time, I'll move on. Now, let me say, as a district like Clayton, as I say, has very strong honors courses. But even, I think it's fair to say, even in a district like Clayton, there are relentless pressures to water down the standards. And I cite, and there are parental override issues. There are all kinds of other issues that we don't have time to get into. In the Q&A, I'm happy to discuss. But I cite Clayton as just one example of many. And Clayton is not one of the worst offenders. Clayton, to its credit, has been trying very hard against the tide to resist these pressures. What's very odd is that in public higher education, you have honors colleges increasingly developed. At my university, University of Missouri St. Louis, in 1989, we created something called the Pierre Laclede Honors College to serve, quote, highly talented and motivated students. University of Michigan has an honors college, University of Georgia, go down the list. In higher education, we've recognized the need to create special opportunities at state universities for the best students who are ready for the most demanding education. In K-12, we're moving exactly in the opposite direction. This makes no sense whatsoever. Either higher ed or K-12 has it wrong. Okay, I think K-12 has it wrong. Fad number 3 is multiple intelligences theory. The main intellectual rationalization now being used to justify the attack on ability grouping is multiple intelligences theory, which is the brainchild of Howard Gardner of Harvard University, who's a very bright fellow. He's a MacArthur Genius Award winner. His theory is a very interesting theory that contains many intriguing insights, but nonetheless has led to some of the most bizarre, silly classroom applications in the history of American education. With MI theory, you can't say the bottom is driving the curriculum because suddenly there's no bottom. Even if you can't write or read or count or think, maybe you can dribble a basketball or perform one of the other 7 intelligences that Gardner identifies. The theory basically says, or at least a common interpretation, in fairness to Gardner, the common interpretation of the theory basically says schools should not be focusing so much on the traditional intelligences of linguistic, verbal intelligence, and mathematical, quantitative, logical reasoning intelligence, but should be attempting to give co-equal treatment to several other intelligences, such as intrapersonal and interpersonal intelligence, which I call musing and schmusing, and then bodily kinesthetic intelligence, which essentially equates slam dunking a basketball with performing open heart surgery. They both use the same tactile talent. So now Dennis Rodman is suddenly a member of the intelligentsia alongside Dr. Michael DeBakey. Humor is considered a form of intelligence. So the class clown has also been added now to the list of academically adept people. I jokingly in the book, I think maybe the editor took it out of the book, but I think originally I suggested maybe we should be inducting the Three Stooges, Tiny Tim, and Pinky Lee into the National Honor Society posthumously. More seriously, Gardner started with 7 intelligences. He's now up to at least 9. He's added a couple. We may end up with several dozen before it's over, all of which have to be accommodated within the 180-day school year, which aggravates the problem of a curriculum a mile wide and an inch deep. Now, again, what I think is driving this is a very well-intentioned, noble notion that we don't want to favor one kid over another, that we don't want to damage any child's self-esteem. But nonetheless, the effects are just, in my judgment, perverse. Fad number 4 is the therapeutic classroom, what I call the Oprahization of American education. This relates to intrapersonal and interpersonal intelligence, of course. Teachers are increasingly being asked to play the role of psychologists and sociologists, for which they are untrained. The school day not only is being taken up with Gardner's smorgasbord of intelligences, but also anger management, conflict resolution, violence prevention, diversity sensitivity training, character education, and about a dozen other things that used to be the purview mainly of family, church, and other institutions. And it seems now it's as if that almost all schools are now considered reform schools, and almost all kids are now considered wayward kids in need of reform school training. I sent a memo once to the Clayton School Board in which I said, quote, most parents are not spending $400,000 a year for a house in Clayton so that their kids can get access to the latest instruction aimed at curbing their killer instincts or producing amateur Mahatma Gandhis or learning the latest verses of Kumbaya. And there's nothing wrong with Kumbaya, but the question is the use of the 180-day school year. Fad number 5 is higher order thinking and the debasement of the basics. Progressives argue that to the extent schools focus on academics, they should be promoting higher order skills, problem solving, and so forth, giving much less attention to the basics of teaching grammar, punctuation, spelling, computation, learning key historical facts and so forth, all of which they dismiss as rote memorization beneath teachers to teach or students to learn. And we hear phrases like, we're moving forward with basics, not back to basics. Well, I once told the school board, I don't care if you go forward with basics, back to basics, or sideways with basics, but I want the basics taught. It is patently absurd to think that any child, or for that matter, any person, can do quality, high-order thinking without a solid foundation in the basics. It's pure atmospherics. K-12 folks, a lot of them tend to refer to their charges, even preschoolers, as a community of scholars. Johnny can't find the potty, but he's a scholar. Meanwhile, we in higher education are left with increasingly doing remedial education, and we sort of feel we're surrounded by graduates of South Park sometimes. But the point is that our education systems, I'm convinced, are being turned upside down. Sure, let's of course do higher order thinking in K-12, absolutely, but we also need to rededicate ourselves to the basics. Again, I think what's driving this is the bottom. If the truth be known, learning basics requires an enormous amount of discipline and effort, something that I think progressives fear some kids may not be able or willing to do. So in place of the old maxim, no pain, no gain, we now have the new one is, if it ain't fun, it can't be done. Very quickly, let's take one by one if we have time. If not, I'll try to cut it short and go to Q&A. But let's take math, for example. Fuzzy math, what some people call ebonics with an equal sign. Okay, I don't claim that's not mine. I got that from Tony Snow or someone else. What's fascinating, if you read the literature and you actually read the fuzzy math inventors, at one side of their mouth, they say that they're promoting higher order thinking, problem solving, and so forth. But at the other side of their mouth, they admit, and it's in black and white, that many of these curricula are targeted at the math phobes, the kids who suffer from math anxiety, the weakest students in math. And so they're encouraged to use calculators so that they don't have to, they can avoid the dreariness and so forth of learning multiplication tables and doing long division. One of the most amazing stories I tell in the book is November 18th, 1999. The Washington Post ran it was an open letter in the Washington Post, November 18th, 1999, to Secretary of Education Riley, signed by some of the 200 of the leading mathematicians in the United States, the chairs of the math departments at Harvard, Yale, Stanford, Caltech, University of Chicago, University of Rochester, go down the list, 4 Nobel laureates, I believe, urging Secretary of Education Riley to repudiate the new fuzzy math curricula precisely because they devalued computation skills and devalued getting the right answer. But this was basically blown off. I could talk about English, but I won't because my good friend Kathy Poor is here today. No. Actually, they have a wonderful English department in Clayton. Let me say a word about social studies. They also have a wonderful social studies department. But they do, and I say that in the book. They're not the problem. The problem is the professional development industry that is getting rich off nonsense. Okay, the guy named Gary Nash at UCLA headed the National History Standards Project in 1995, and he was quoted at the time as saying, "We want, quote, we want to liberate students from the prison of facts," end of quote. Now, how one can do higher order thinking, or how you can even remotely do critical thinking about American democracy without knowing the most elemental features of about the Republic and basic facts about American history, I don't quite understand. Half the American people do not know they have 2 senators, much less can name them, and yet we're told we're overdosing people on facts. Read the National Geographic report last December, I think it was. 87% of 18-year-olds can't find Afghanistan or Iraq on a map. 80% can't find Afghanistan. 50% can't find New York, and 11% can't find the United States. The National Association of Scholars did a study also this past December in which they found that the average college graduate today has about the historical information level as a high school graduate in 1955. David Broder, in July 4th, 2000, wrote a piece, Losing Our Civic Memory, in which he said even graduates of Harvard and Amherst were clueless about what the Gettysburg Address said or anything about it. The late Albert Shanker, one of my heroes, the former head of the American Federation of Teachers, just before he died in 1997, wrote a piece in the New York Times called Knowledge Still Counts. Can you imagine an educator feeling a need to actually write an article entitled Knowledge Still Counts? Okay, let me wrap up in just a minute or two, and then we'll open it up. What we have, in my judgment, is one gigantic muddle right now. In the last chapter of the book, I try to offer a way out of the great American education war. I call for a ceasefire, based on really some very commonsensical, not terribly profound ideas. I urge that and yet even though these are non-profound ideas and commonsensical, there's enormous intense debate and contentiousness and infighting occurring over this. I urge we strike a balance between the best of progressive education and the best of traditionalist education. I've just spent about 30 minutes bashing progressive education. I want to emphasize something I mentioned in the book repeatedly. Progressives have some incredibly great ideas. If only they would apply them in greater moderation and not throw the baby out with the bathwater. F. Scott Fitzgerald once wrote that the test of a first-rate mind is to be able to hold 2 competing ideas in your mind at once and still function. Well, let's try it for a minute. Let's dedicate ourselves to promoting both creativity and rigor, higher order thinking and memorization and basic skills, active learning and direct instruction, targeting resources at both slow learners and fast learners. These are not mutually exclusive ideas. And I go on to say, in conclusion, that if schools are not going to respond to this call for balance and to respond to the concerns that traditionalists have raised, then I think we need to open the game up to choice. Let me stress, I'm a public school person. I'm a product of the public schools. My kids went to public schools. I never thought of sending my kids even remotely to private schools. I believe in the public schools. But if they're not going to respond, then I think we do have to give parents some options. Progressives love to talk about empowering children. Well, maybe we need to empower adults, parents, to choose the option they think best. If a parent wants diagramming of sentences they should be able to get it without having to hire outside tutors. If they want their kids to learn math facts more than they're learning, they shouldn't have to hire some kind of Kumon math instructor. Progressives talk a good game about diversity and accommodating diverse learning styles, but in my judgment, it's a one-size-fits-all constructivist paradigm. The same people who tell children there are no right or wrong answers, when it comes to parents, claim a monopoly of wisdom. And not only with parents, but traditionalist educators, progressives claim a monopoly of wisdom. So I call for a peaceful, more productive dialogue. That's why I wrote the book. And I'll stop there and be happy to take your questions. Thank you. Anyone have a question, a comment, a disagreement, hopefully? Yes. Now, do we need to, I think the mic has to come around. Did you want to ask a question? Is that right? If you could just wait one moment.
I'm in a master's program right now for teaching. I've never taught before, but am now re-entered into a master's program, and am interested to know what you would say to all of my professors who are going to teach me to teach, if you could.
What I would say is really my final salvo at the end, which is please, I'd make a plea to please be more sensitive to alternative, diverse points of view that are not always taught in schools of education. Someone like E.D. Hirsch, who wrote Cultural Literacy and the Schools We Need. Someone like Tom Lovelace, the director of the Brown Center of Educational Policy at the Brookings Institution. Chester Finn, Sandra Stotsky, who wrote Losing Our Language, a wonderful book. I would urge that your professors not only assign Sizer and Meyer and Gardner and Alfie Kohn. I particularly would hope they wouldn't assign Alfie Kohn, but that's all right. But those others are giant figures in education who certainly deserve to be heard, but so do Hirsch and Lovelace and Ravitch, Diane Ravitch. So I call for diversity. That's what I would hope would happen. I think there's one there, and then I'm going to rate it.
Yes, I was just going to say, I've been teaching for 32 years in University City School System, and I believe students, just from talking to them, want to be intellectually engaged. Unfortunately, there are many teachers that are teaching now that don't know the first thing about how to plan lessons. And if you want to paraphrase in the Clinton administration, it's the teacher stupid. And if we don't have bright, creative teachers, it doesn't matter what you say. Our society does not value them. We don't put the resources into training them. 1/3 of all teachers leave after 5 years because they're so frustrated, many of the brightest ones. What do you have to say about that? How could we encourage our society as a whole to really value teaching?
That's a great question. First of all, my book is not against teachers. In fact, my book is dedicated to quote those remarkable, brilliant teachers, not facilitators, my children learn from. I value teachers enormously. What I would say in answer to your question is that part of the reason why teachers leave the profession and don't even begin to enter the profession certainly has to do with salary. You're absolutely right. We have to improve salaries. But another reason is discipline. The fact that administrators do not back teachers up with discipline. The fact that we don't teach, in my judgment, don't treat teachers as professionally as we should. I think frankly, we should have a merit pay system. If you're a superstar teacher, as in higher education, you should be entitled to major salary increases beyond the norm. And if you're deadwood, you should be fired. This is very hard to do today. A lot of very talented young people who would like to go into teaching, quite frankly, they don't see how it's a profession. So I take your point. Teaching is absolutely critical. It's one of the most important jobs in the profession, and frankly, what you do is more important than what I do for a living at higher education. Somebody else had a...
I'm speaking as a parent. I'm a mom, and I'm a mom who's been there at field trips, which in the city schools and the magnet schools, we sometimes have 6 a month in one classroom. Field trips, parties, all that kind of stuff. I'm there at the school all the time. And the things that I see are pretty much what you've described. I mean, that I have to agree with 100% of it. Another thing that I've noticed, though, and I have to question, is the kids don't have fun anymore. Everything is a lesson. The field trips are a lesson. They don't have their one field trip a year that's fun. Their recesses have been cut down to about 20 minutes a day, and that's it. 20 minutes out of each day of a 7-hour period for children. And then they're not allowed to speak at lunch. They get in trouble if they talk at lunch. They're not allowed to be children anymore at school. It is what I witness in the name of trying to get accreditation. And this is two different school systems. This is the magnet schools here in the city, and also a rural school that, was out in the country and supposed to be very good. And both situations, I experienced the same thing.
Well, I think, first of all, schools vary enormously in this respect. Clayton, for example, takes great pride in having an open campus and promoting, for better or worse, and there's an upside and a downside, student freedom. And so my guess is in Clayton there may be a somewhat different view of things. But I'll be honest with you, one thing that constantly puzzles me when I read the New York Times or other reports about backpacks getting too big and kids getting too stressed and too much homework, maybe because I'm just old school, I guess, I don't quite get it. I know what I had to do as a student. For example, I tell the story in the book. It was, as a matter of routine, I walked about 6-7 blocks to a bus, got on a bus, went about 7 miles, got off a bus, got on another bus. It took me an hour to get to Baltimore City College High School, okay? Each way. Nobody whined about it. I mean, it was what you did. It was the best school in town. That's what you did. Today, it'd be child abuse litigation.
I agree with that. But what I'm asking, though, is I did, back in the 60s and 70s, have 3 recesses. They were 15 minutes, 20 minutes. They're just not, there's so much time consumed in having to be in the classroom, and then plus all the field trips and the other stuff that interferes.
Well, again, this raises the issue of what can you cram into a 7-hour a day, 180-day school year. I think we're trying to do too much. I think we're asking teachers to do too much. I don't know if there's someone else who has a question or a comment. I think someone here.
I have a question about AP classes. I think in your book, I'm not sure what page it's on, I've run it down the row, but you talk about the fact that so many kids want to get into AP classes, some that are not academically that able, and how it waters down the AP classes. And I have a little different take on that, and I don't know if you're familiar with a book by Jay Matthews. I think he's a professor, I think he's on the staff of the Washington Post. He wrote one called Class Struggle a few years back. And his, I think, basic thesis was that the best high schools, and he just wrote about high schools, not about K through 12, the best high schools have a lot of AP classes and AP students in them. They encourage all kids who want to take AP classes, but also he really pushes that anyone who takes an AP class really ought to take the exam because they'll get more out of the class if they know they're preparing for the exam. And I'm wondering what you think about that idea of allowing anyone who really wants to take a challenging course to do so, but not watering down the course and pushing those kids to take the AP exam.
Well, first of all, I've exchanged a lot of emails with Jay Matthews. We have a friendly disagreement over this issue. By the way, he called my book a great read, I'm happy to say. So thanks for the plug for bringing up Jay Matthews. I respect him a lot, and you're right, he has a very different take on this. But I'll give you my take, and it's what you suggested, and that is this, that I don't understand how logically something can be billed as the ultimate capstone academic challenge that a K-12 system has to offer, which AP is, and yet is doable by every last kid in the building. I'm sorry, I don't understand. Again, it's mass excellence. I don't understand the concept. Now, let me say this. I respect your point, and in fact, I would agree with you that certainly we should be willing to probably take a broader view than we have, certainly when I went to school, of giving kids a chance, but I don't think you just give any kid a chance who wants to be in there, because think about it. What that means is, what if, Johnny wants to be in AP because his girlfriend Shirley's there. Now, Johnny's now in AP, and of course the teacher has to call on Johnny every few minutes or whatever, every few days. It's a waste of time for the other students in the class. It really, in my judgment, undermines the academic integrity of the program, but I do take your point. I think this gentleman and
Marty is a good friend and colleague, and my name's Dennis Lubeck. I've been in education since 1965, 20 years as a teacher and another 15 or so in the professional development world. That's been criticized pretty sharply in the book, and some of it deserved, without any question. But I have a couple of sort of related questions that I think are important, and one is the book focuses a lot on progressive education versus traditional education, and a sort of a plea for a ceasefire at the end of the book. And I guess one part of this is this really it's an important issue, but is it the primary issue? And I think Mrs. Shapiro, teacher who asked that question before, and isn't the issue really having people of academic substance who care for kids entering the profession, and that the pedagogy is kind of secondary to the quality of the people entering the profession. And a related point, which I found intriguing. The book is I should preface this, it's a great read, and I applaud you for stimulating debate. We need to debate education issues more than we do. But a related question relates to what I think is a problem in the book, from my point of view, and the names really don't matter, because I know this C-SPAN's filming this, and this is going to go to a national audience, not just to a local audience. But I noticed that you used what I think of as very gifted administrative leaders, one from a private school, one from a public school, and that you also used you admitted this, very gifted teachers. One was an English teacher, one was a history teacher, as examples of what's wrong. And I guess the question is, can you use the best to prove the worst? I mean, in other words, you were using very gifted people showing what's wrong with American education. Isn't that what we should be applauding? Having administrators and teachers of that kind of caliber that you use are cited as a problem. So these are kind of related to the kind of quality of people that we have working in our schools with our kids. So.
Well, first of all, I had about 30 minutes to give my take, and even in 300 pages, frankly, I don't think you can truly capture the complexity of these issues. We're talking about a lot of pieces of the puzzle. James Coleman in 1966 still had, I think, the definitive study that said there's a limit to what schools can do in the absence of parents and strong home family support systems where kids are encouraged to read books, to study, to do homework. There's a limit to what any school in America can do. So parents are part of the problem. Teachers are part of the problem in terms of teachers. We need higher standards for teachers. I mentioned in Clayton and elsewhere there's some brilliant teachers, and they're not the problem. But the way we credential teachers these days, frankly, is very, very questionable. I think there are just a lot of people who don't belong anywhere near a classroom who are teaching. We need higher standards for teachers. And I still think it comes down to a commitment to standards in the classroom. And this is where the AP question comes in. What do we consider standards? Are we committed to the very highest academic integrity and standards? And I think that is fundamental. Now, let me get to the second question about how the fact that I perhaps unfairly seem to criticize some of the most brilliant minds in education, Howard Gardner, and some other people. Well, again, my point is that it's easy to criticize the idiots. It's easy to criticize, inner city schools. That's been done. Okay, I was trying to show that the problem is systemic and endemic in education generally. That even in the best places, among the best minds, you can see some, in my judgment, fuzzy thinking. In chapter 2 of the book, I talk about the Stockholm syndrome in reverse, where you know, Stockholm Syndrome is where terrorist captives tend to start taking on the views of their captors. Well, in education, it seems the more you're around children, the more you start thinking like children sometimes. And I'm talking about some brilliant people. Some of these ideas that I write about, that I personally witnessed, and so forth, I think are ridiculous. And yet some of them are coming from the very best minds. So I don't know if that adequately answers your question. Anyone else? This lady here.
As was discussed earlier, the superintendent of the St. Louis Public Schools announced his resignation yesterday, and I wondered if you were superintendent of the St. Louis Public Schools, what you would do. And related, with 42,000 students, most of whom are below grade level, and related to that is, how could you make sure, what would you do to make sure that all children were reading on or above grade level by third grade?
Yeah. Well, it's a great question. It's easy for me to stand up here and tell you what I would do if I were the superintendent of St. Louis City Schools. This is an enormous challenge. I come back to the Coleman report that there's a limit to what even those teachers can do and that superintendent can do in the absence of very solid home support systems. But nonetheless, even though there's a limit, we have to try. And in fact, it's absolutely critical to reach these kids and to somehow find a way to get through. Now, with regard to reading, for example, there's no question. Whole language doesn't work with many of those students, not all those students, but many of those students. They need much more systemic, structured, disciplined, explicit. If you want to call it phonics, call it phonics. And I'm not talking about all those students in the inner city. One thing I really object to, and I say this in the book, is I really object to stereotyping and racial profiling that goes on too much. But clearly, there's no question that many of the kids in inner city schools, whether they're black or white, come from homes which, for various reasons, do not, either they don't value reading, or the parents are too busy or too poor, and there's some very legitimate reasons sometimes. And so these are the problems you have to deal with. Now, so one quick answer to your question, I think you need to change the reading programs in a lot of these schools, I think, okay? A second is they do have some excellent schools in the city, like Metro, and some others, and I think they need to do more of a job of trying to target highly talented kids to some, again, very high-powered programs, more than are currently being served. I think that they need to listen to E.D. Hirsch. E.D. Hirsch is a guy who, a professor at University of Virginia, who in 1988 wrote a book called Cultural Literacy, in which he said that all kids, rich, poor, black, white, but particularly poor kids, needed to get exposure to basic, solid, factual, historical information. Who was Julius Caesar? Who was Cleopatra? Whatever. Lincoln, George Washington, Jefferson. Because, and particularly inner city kids, because if they don't get it in school, they're not going to get it. The rich kids will get it one way or another. Hirsch was accused of being a right-winger, Eurocentric, every name in the book imaginable. He started something called the Core Knowledge Foundation, and it's been very successful in a number of inner city schools. I don't know the extent to which the city of St. Louis uses it. If they don't, they should. It's not a panacea. The problems are so challenging, but there are some of those things that could happen. I know that doesn't adequately answer your question. It's a huge challenge, but those are some of the things. Someone else? Well, I think there's someone over there. Did you read?
Why is it that a country like Costa Rica, which has one of the highest literacy rates in the world, can manage to make literacy happen, as poor as they are and as limited as their resources are, whereas a country like the United States, with virtually unlimited resources, can't find a way to obtain the same level of literacy?
Well, actually, technically, if you look at the World Bank Atlas, or you look at similar kinds of so-called authoritative sources of data, believe it or not, it says that the United States has 99% literacy, just like Costa Rica. Now, I don't know enough about Costa Rica to say whether that figure is more valid in their case than our case or not. It's a good question. I honestly don't have a good answer to your question other than to repeat something I said earlier, which is I think In my judgment, in English language arts, I think we're doing one of the worst jobs. And I don't say Clayton, I'm just talking generally in the United States, because I think there's not enough attention to systematic grammar and punctuation and mechanics and so forth. For example, in 1996, the National Council of Teachers of English in 1996 produced their so-called National English Standards, which pushed inventive spelling, PowerPoint, all kinds of things, virtually nothing about the use of language, the clear, tight, accurate use of standard English conventions. The New York Times called the National Council of Teachers of English National Standards pedagogical molasses. I think the Department of Education pulled the funding on it, and yet the National Council of Teachers of English, I know, is very respected among English teachers, and I'll just be very honest with you. I don't know why. I don't know why. Yeah. I think, let's let this.
Why do the teachers' unions tolerate mediocrity, and in some cases worse? Because unless you commit rape on the church steps at high noon, you can't be fired in some states. Can you answer the question without using the word tenure?
Well, of course, I have tenures. We're fighting post-tenure review at for full professors at the university. But anyway, look, I don't want to turn this into a union bashing session. Unions are part of the problem. Now, we all know why unions exist, and we all know the good things they do. They will protect teachers who often do need protection, whether for academic freedom or whatever. They do some very important good things. But there's no question that they protect dead wood. There's absolutely no question about it. I would like to see, maybe it's not possible, I would like to see in K-12 education a merit-based system, as I indicated before, that's more similar to higher education. In higher education, at my university or most universities, when there is money available for raises, which these days is rare, not everybody gets the same percentage increase in salary. If you've just written 2 books one year, you get a higher increase than the person who's been mowing his lawn most of the year, okay? In K-12 education, everybody gets the same, basically. I mean, according to, there's a system of steps and so forth. Not everybody gets the same exact salary, but it's all unionized. I really genuinely respect teachers so much. I think we need to start treating them like the professionals they are. I want superstar teachers to be paid better, much better than they now are. There are other teachers who don't deserve to be in the classroom. I think this gentleman over here had...
I guess I'm speaking as a product of one of those really great public schools, Ladue High School. I'm very thankful for the education I got there, and I'm still working on being a product of the public schools. I'm at the University of Illinois. And I think that one of the problems that I've seen with what you've said so far is the definition of excellence. I think your definition is very misleading and is putting pressures on my peers and those a few years younger than me that we don't need and don't help us. I think that the emphasis on AP coursework isn't necessary. I think it pushes people to go past the basics and sees learning the basics in high school as insufficient, and it makes people feel like there's something wrong with them. Now, I'm saying this from the perspective of someone who took a lot of AP courses, and I did well. And I get to college and they're telling me that I've already completed 3 semesters of my college education. But one of the other things I did in high school, I spent some time tutoring other students who weren't doing so well. And some of the students who I tutored in my senior year of high school were sophomores, juniors, and we'd start working on things like calculus, and they wouldn't know how to multiply fractions. And wait, what's happening there? Why are they taking a course that's pushing them ahead? Why are they trying to achieve this standard of excellence before they've mastered the basics? So I think it's this push for so-called excellence that is undermining students' ability to achieve excellence in the end, and also that puts enormous psychological pressure on people to have these high test scores and to have finished almost half of their college education before they even go to college. I think that's a huge problem. And I think we need to come up with a definition of excellence that means getting a good high school education in 4 years of high school and then moving on.
I think you make some very good points, many of which, by the way, I agree with. But let me ask you this. Do you think mass excellence makes any sense? Would you say mass excellence is a meaningful concept?
No, I don't think it is. But I also think that it's a very... I think it's a dirty form of upper-class warfare when a kid like me gets the education I got and poor kids in the inner cities don't learn basic math skills, and the school that I go to gets twice the funding they do. I think that's
Well,
dirty, and I think it's wrong.
I think you need to probably try to eliminate. Look, I respect that, and in fact, I welcome a diverse set of views, which I, in fact, hope would be more of in more of this conversation in education. So I respect very much what you're saying. I agree with part of what you're saying about AP. As far as the latter term, I mean, we have a capitalist system. Now, if you don't want capitalism, that you're free to take that point of view. I respect that. But, you know, what you're talking about, of course, is not a capitalist system. So you need to decide in your own mind whether you want a capitalist system or not. And I'm not saying which is better. You all, everybody in this room really has to make that determination. Let me just say something else about the whole business of making demands on people. You know, I mentioned we have an honors college at University of Missouri St. Louis. You ask any professor at the University of Missouri St. Louis or any professor in America, if they teach an honors course and they teach a non-honors course, whether they make the same demands on all students. It's well understood that in an honors class you can make far more demands, intellectual challenge on students than you have them read more books, write longer papers than you can in a regular class. It just can't be done. If you put everybody in the same class, you are watering down the curriculum, and there is absolutely no question about it. And that's where I'm coming from. I believe all kids, I said before, all kids can learn, must learn, should learn. By the way, I'm against the old style tracking that I had at Baltimore City College High School, where it was too exclusivist. One set of kids went one way, never saw the other kids. I'm not advocating it. I'm advocating course by course, subject by subject. If you've got a bunch of math whizzes ready to soar, put them together. They may not be English whizzes. Maybe they'll be in the regular English class with everybody else. If you've got some gifted writers, put them together. If you have some gifted artists, put them together. What we're doing is we're putting them all together in this one huge heterogeneous classroom, and we're pretending, we now use the term individualizing instruction, we're having everybody doing drawing, dancing, writing, and everything else across the curriculum. It's ridiculous, and that's where I'm coming from. This lady here. I'm sorry if... Sorry.
Hi. Let's see, I'm speaking as a former public school teacher of 14 years, and right now, for the last 13 years, I've been in teacher education at Washington University. I'm a professor in that part of our program. And kind of to add to the complexity of the problem, as you referred to it, I wonder how many people are aware of, in terms of teacher preparation, where do those directions come from? Well, they come from the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education in the state of Missouri. And that is a one-way pipeline. Okay, and most recently, in 1997, the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, as an example, watered down the requirements to become a science teacher in this state to the point where you had to have 8 semester hours of biology, and you could be a biology teacher. 8 semester hours of chemistry, and you could be a chemistry teacher in the high school. Now, that's absurd. And what happened at an institution like ours is people stopped becoming certified as science teachers because it was ridiculous. And we couldn't support that as an institution. Most recently, the latest trend from the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education is for colleges of education, for departments of education statewide to find faster ways to certify people. Okay? Most recently, they sent a statement to us telling us that if someone was working as a teacher's aide in a school, okay, and wanted to become a certified teacher, we could not ask them to do any kind of student teaching within our program. We had to accept their work as a teacher aide as evidence of that. Okay. One last thing.
Sure.
As you know, reflection of this, I think it was last spring, there was a huge article in the Post-Dispatch about how the St. Louis City Public School District had hired 49 Teach for America people. Now, I'm not against Teach for America, but they talked about how they wined and dined these new teachers, so on and so forth, way more than they've done with other people who go there as new teachers. And again, I consistently hear this even at my own university, where people say, well, I'd like to go do Teach for America because I'd like to teach for a few years before I decide what I want to do.
Yeah. Well,
Okay?
yeah.
So I guess in defense of teachers, I want to say that, we're not in control of, in many ways, how we prepare them.
Yeah.
That comes down from on high.
Well, I also mentioned the parents, but let me just respond. First of all, you're at Washington University, is that right? Yeah, well, obviously, WashU has a very rigorous, respected program. Not all ed schools in America are that way. I know WashU's is. Now, let me say a couple things. First of all, you're right that, and here my political science hat comes on. There's a lot of politics involved here. When you talk about the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education in Missouri or anywhere else, what has to happen is parents and others have to mobilize, including school districts, to put pressure on legislators, to put pressure on the bureaucracy to change the rules. I mean, it's called politics. Let me just say one word, though, about alternative certification. I take your point that it can end up in disaster, very untrained teachers. But let me just give you one quick anecdote and case study that suggests maybe we need a little more flexible accreditation requirements. I had a student last summer in my American politics class. Brilliant young lady, had a bachelor's degree from Truman State University, which is a respected university certainly in Missouri, and a master's degree in English and a bachelor's degree, and was dedicated, wanted to teach high school English. Incredibly intellectual, master's degree in English, enormously substantively well-trained, well-read. She told me horror stories, what she had to go through. I won't name the school of education, but in fact, she had to take my course. Now, she said she liked it. Of course, that was before I graded her, but the point is, why did she have to take Intro to American Politics to teach high school English? And she probably had to take some kind of lab science and some kind of public speaking and who knows what. This young lady desperately wanted to get in the classroom. For a minute, I'd have my kid learn from her in a minute. And that's happening all over the country.
I have to say that just those courses, just the courses you outlined right there, those are all designated by the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education.
Well, we all need to change that, I think. Yeah.
And I guess I want to make that point because it's so easy to say the schools. And images of tenured teachers who couldn't, teach their way out of a paper bag come to mind. And it's a lot more complex than that. And as taxpayers and voters, sooner or later, we have to take responsibility to change how, power is organized in the educational system. And it's not organized at the school level. Not very well organized. It's organized at the state, well, not even federal level so much as the state. And it's not enough to point the finger and say who's not doing a good job when we're ignorant of how those decisions are made and stay out of how those decisions are made.
I take your point, and I did say it's an incredibly complex problem. Anyone else? I'm sorry, someone's been waiting. I don't know.
J. Martin Rochester is author of Class Warfare, Besieged Schools, Bewildered Parents, Betrayed Kids, and the Attack on Excellence. It's published by Encounter Books on the web at encounterbooks.com.